back to the second session of the Global Dialogues, an initiative led by the Georgetown University, promoted by Tom Banchov, the Vice President of Global Engagement, and Pankaj Mishra, writer, essay writer, and well known here for his work at Galaxia Gutenberg and for his long-lasting relationship at CCCB. I would like to thank them both for having trusted in CCCB for this fascinating and necessary initiative. Yesterday we kicked off with a session on solidarity, and today we dig into one of the distinctive elements of today's world,
i la
the
crueltat en el
normalization of
discurs
hate
públic i en
and
l'exercici
cruelty
del poder,
in the public
tant en règims
debate
formalment
and
democràtics
in
com en les
power,
autocràcies.
both in democracies and in autocratic regimes. Yesterday, we said that global dialogues aim at opening to, in the context of war and climate change, as well as the disruption of the artificial intelligence. Today we have well-known voices of the Global South, whom in dialogue with authors of our context help us broaden and enrich the public debate with other references, traditions and cultures. We are aware of the fact that contemporary crises are also a crisis of imagination, a crisis of lack of renewed, fresh political ideas that help us rethink a world which is different from the one that was born out of the ashes of the Second World War. It is a pleasure to welcome Veronica Gago and Edurne Portela, two very loved authors, and hosting Rick Malik, a British Sudanese writer, and Joseba Ebola, who works tirelessly in the defense of a public debate based on quality. Thank you very much to all of you. Yesterday, Hisham Matar said that solidarity is an impulse towards action in favor of general interest and common well-being. The ethical and political commitment of CCCB as a cultural institution is to fight against the empire of cruelty through education, the defense of
mundos y otras maneras de vivir juntos. Paso ahora la palabra.
And now I'll pass the floor over to Safwan Mandri, Dean of the University of Georgetown in Doha, and thank you so much everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much, Judith. I understood Safwan Masri and Georgetown University in Qatar. That's the extent of it. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to welcome you to the second day of the Georgetown Global Dialogues. My sincere thanks go to Tom Banchov and Pankaj Mishra and our colleagues at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs for convening this extraordinary exchange. Thank you as well to Judith Carrera and the Center de Cultura Contemporánea de Barcelona for your generosity and for hosting us with such warmth. We look forward to hosting all of you in Doha in March. I will be brief, but I want to begin with an ancient scene, one that captures how human frailty can dissolve enmity in an instant. In the Iliad, after years of brutal war, Achilles, the embittered warrior who has lost his dearest friend, meets Priam, the aged father of his fallen enemy. The king kneels before him, begging for his son's body, and implores Achilles to remember his own father's mortality. Overcome by the memory of love and loss, as Homer writes, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept for man-killing Hector, as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus, and their sobbing rose and fell. In that moment, the fiercest Greek hero and the bereaved Trojan patriarch recognize each other's pain and humanity. The story endures because it reveals something elemental, even in the aftermath of violence. The acknowledgement of shared fragility can restore empathy. If Achilles and Priam could glimpse solidarity through sorrow, might we, amid a less literal war, find it through our own shared vulnerabilities? Now, yesterday's discussions explored political fragmentation and the rise of radical individualism. This is the paradoxical age we live in. We are more concerned than ever through technology. We are more connected than ever through technology, yet more divided than ever by tribalism, polarization, and solitude. Nations pull inward, communities fracture along partisan and sectarian lines, and an ideology of self-sufficiency erodes our sense of belonging. The result is not only political division, but spiritual estrangement, a world where isolation masquerades as autonomy. Yet acknowledging interdependence requires what the philosopher Iris Murdoch called the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Her insight is both moral and imaginative. Art and ethics share a single foundation, the ability to perceive beyond the self. If our age is marked by self-absorption, then nurturing that capacity for unselfing becomes a radical act. It breaks the spell of isolation. It reminds us that the person across the border or across the aisle is as real and as breakable as we are. Tonight's panel turns to a darker symptom of this fragmentation, rising cruelty, a creeping social Darwinism that glorifies strength and mocks compassion. We see it in the rhetoric that dehumanizes migrants and minorities, in policies that punish the poor, and in wars and genocides where civilian suffering is treated as collateral. Recent years have made our fragility unmistakably global, as seen in a virus that crossed every border and a climate crisis that recognizes none. As our vulnerabilities are intertwined, so too must our solidarities be. The choice before us is stark. Retreat into silos of each against all, or build a future of each for all. The latter demands that we believe care can extend beyond kin and kind, and that empathy can be scaled. This then is the solidarity of the fragile. As these dialogues unfold, let us remember that thinking is only half our task. The other is to begin remaking the world anew. If each of us leaves this gathering carrying even one spark of another's insight, one renewal sense of care, we will have kindled the slow, redemptive work of building a common future. Thank you.
Hola, hola. Bona tarda, benvinguts a aquesta sessió dels Georgetown.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session against cruelty. My apologies, but my Catalan is rather poor. I understand Catalan, but I do not speak it fluently, so I will switch into Spanish if you don't mind.
Aquí estamos esta tarde para hablar de la
So here we are this afternoon to talk about cruelty,
una manifestación de la bajeza
a manifestation
humana,
of the
desgraciadamente en auge.
base human nature which is
Son tantas
rising.
manifestaciones de la
There are so many manifestations of cruelty that we see in our daily lives,
y de tan distintos órdenes,
and so different amongst themselves that the difficult thing is to choose what type of cruelty to talk about in this session.
pero permítanme lo primero presentarles a nuestros
But let me
contertulias,
first
que
introduce
aunque lo hayan
our
podido leer
speakers, even if you've read
el programa, creo que siempre
the
está
program.
bien,
I think it's always
saber
nice
quién está hablando,
to know who is talking, and I will remind you who's here with us this evening.
Voy a empezar por Nesrin
I
Malik,
will start with
que es una escritora y
Nasrin Malik.
periodista
She is
británico-sudanesa,
a British
conocida por
Sudanese
sus
writer and
reflexiones
journalist,
sobre
recognized
temas
for
como
her
la
reflections
raza,
on
la
race,
identidad, la
identity,
política y asuntos de
politics,
actualidad
and
internacional.
international current affairs.
Su libro, We Need
Her book,
Stories,
We Need
Challenging
New
the Toxic
Stories,
Myths
Challenging the
Behind Our
Toxic
Age of
Myths Behind Our
Discontent,
Age of
que es del
Discontent,
año 2019,
from
necesitamos
2019,
nuevas historias, desafiar los mitos tóxicos
is
y
now
los
translating
del
the
descontento,
title into
critica
Spanish,
las bases
critiques the
narrativas
narrative
del
foundations of the increasingly intolerant and authoritarian politics that we're seeing in the United Kingdom and the United States. She has published columns in outlets such as The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, when she is part of the team at Equator, equator.org, a political, cultural and arts magazine, which was just born and we have to celebrate it. And amongst other things, there they give a voice to the Global South, a voice that we have to listen to. Nasrin Malik, in her columns, writes about Islamophobia, feminism, and African politics with analysis such as how colonial and post-colonial analysis legacies shape the contemporary world, she has also emphasized the importance of journalism and the media in the fight against misinformation and hate speech. This is Nesrine Malik, and I will introduce our speakers one by one, but each of them will have some time to speak, to talk about cruelty.
Nesrine, good evening. Can you speak us about cruelty?
Hello, there we are. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to see so many of you here. This is my third Georgetown Global Dialogues with my colleagues and with so many friends now that have become part of the journey. Each one is special, but this one feels a little bit more special. I don't know if that grammatically makes sense. But it feels very special to me. There's something about the particular moment that we're in, the context that we're in, the kind of Barcelona, Spanish culture and hospitality, and political solidarity that the region has shown over the past couple of years with Palestine that makes me feel very at home here. So thank you, and thank you for coming. So I'm Nesrine, as I was introduced. I'm always introduced as British Sudanese, but it's Sudanese British. It just flows better to start with the B than the S, but I was originated in Sudan and then became British. And I'd like to talk today briefly, before I hand over to my friends, about the origins of cruelty as we are discussing it today, and exactly what are we talking about. Dean Masri gave a perfect introduction to specify the sort of ambient cruelty, atmospheric cruelty that we live with towards immigrants, towards the poor, towards people who need help, who require state support, and broadly towards the other, the minor, the weaker, the individual who is lower down the hierarchy. And it is a performative cruelty. It's not a cruelty that seems to have much purpose. And before I carry on, I just want to caution that inevitably, because this is, again, as introduced by yourself, there's so many types of cruelty to choose from that I think we will speak inevitably in generalities a little bit today. But I want to focus on not cruelty as a feature of humanity that sits alongside other impulses, sits along kindness, empathy, sadism, self-torture, masochism, all of these things make up a human being. Cruelty does not have a superior position, but it can be activated. I want to talk about cruelty as a feature of politics. Cruelty has always existed as part of human nature and has always existed as part of politics, but what I think is new, and I'm very happy to be challenged on this, but what I think is new is the mainstreaming of cruelty as a political way of advancing how we talk about each other. It feels like cruelty has become the language of politics, not everywhere, but in some very prominent examples. Cruelty has become the way politics is transacted. And what I mean by that is that it's not enough just to pass a law against immigration. It's not enough to pass a law to deprive people of benefits for their children. It's not enough to reverse movements for racial and gender equality. You must also shout about it, right? You must also humiliate the people that you're doing that to. You must, in some instances, as is done in the US and the UK, parade them in shackles in front of everybody on screen, and even render them in illustrations and cartoons for people to laugh and mock, to laugh at and mock. This is not a cruelty that has a ideological purpose or even a practical purpose. It is cruelty for its own sake. And here I always quote this essay, which was actually quite prescient by Adam Serwer, called "The Cruelty is the Point." written in 2017, I believe, or 2018, in the first Trump administration, when people were wondering, why is Trump so flagrant and flamboyant with his cruelty? And the premise of this piece was, the point is the cruelty. It's not a byproduct of the policy. So I think this is the sort of cruelty that we're talking about. How has cruelty become the end? And I think that there is a long history to this that's not just about dictatorship or demagoguery or just particularly nasty people that have been voted into power. I think cruelty has become a necessary way of transacting politics, because politics in so many of these countries has reached a dead end. There are fewer and fewer ways in which you can promise people a better life. Over decades, so much of the promise, hope, and horizons that people would look forward to have become diminished. Public spaces have become diminished. Our extended families have become fractured. The value and price of the spaces in which we live have risen. So we live in smaller and smaller abodes. We are siloed off from each other. We have less and less from our governments. A general leeching away and diminishment of public good. And when I talk about public good, I mean the kind of broad safety net of what the state can offer, but also the basic expectation that you will live a broadly dignified life, right? You're not going to have to hustle and scramble and struggle to be able to buy a home, secure safe schooling, housing for your children, secure some healthcare, and die in dignity. These are no longer things we can take for granted. In many of these sort of capitalist economies that have over the past, I would say, 40 years, for several reasons which we don't have time to get into, have become more mean and tight-fisted. So what are you going to do as a politician when you can't promise people housing, you can't promise them healthcare, you can't promise them clean streets, you can't promise them even aspiration, you can't even promise them the status quo. You can't even say your life is going to stay as it is, because it's going to get worse. So what you do is you start pointing to the others who, A, are responsible for your fate now, and who will make things worse in the future if we don't get rid of them. And that's how you create this, what I call exploitation of scarcity. There's a sense that everything is scarce. Instead of addressing the root causes of that scarcity, which is how our economics and our politics is arranged, how privatization and draining public infrastructure and converting it to be exploited by private capital, all of these things are not discussed. What is discussed is the immigrant, the person on benefits, the minority voter, the other, and all sorts of protagonists, single mothers, people on welfare. I mean, in the UK, it's a whole carousel that just keeps running around, Muslims. And so, as a politician, cruelty to you is very useful. And so it becomes the mode of government, and therefore it has to become the language of government as well. And as far as the recipients of cruelty are concerned, the kind of retail recipients of cruelty, you and me and everyone around us, you are also suffering from scarcity. You are not given a sort of wide perspective of why these things happen. And even then, it's not satisfying to you. How satisfying is it to me that deregulation that began in the 1970s is responsible for labor insecurity? I can't do anything with that. But if you tell me that an immigrant is taking your job, you can feel that, right? You can act on it. It lands somewhere. And so this feedback loop happens between people who want quick, satisfying answers, visceral answers that feel like silver bullets, and politicians who are feeding them these solutions. And in the middle are caught people who are traduced, humiliated, treated badly, vilified. And cruelty becomes this sort of circus-like performance that we all are involved in. I'll stop there, but this is sort of my conceptualization of what we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very inspiring words, Nesrine. Thank you. Verónica Gago.
Veronica Gago is a political theorist, professor of the Faculty of Social Sciences in the universities, researcher of the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research. Her research focuses on international social movements, especially feminism and critique to neoliberal research. She's a member of the movement Ni Una Menos and was part of the militant research group Situaciones. She has authored, amongst other books, La razón neoliberal, Economías barrocas y pragmática popular, and she's also authored La potencia feminista, o El deseo de cambiarlo todo. She's a member of the publisher Tinta Limón. She's received the Martin Diskin Award granted by the Latin American Studies Association for commitment to social justice and teaching. And in May 2025, together with researcher Lucy Caballero, she published her book Contra el autoritarismo de la libertad financiera. Veronica, what can you tell us about cruelty? Hello. Thank you very much to Global Dialogues for making us gather here again at the CCCV, allowing us to gather here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank my colleagues, my panel colleagues. Thank you for inviting us to this conversation. What can I say? Coming from Argentina, I think I can say a lot about cruelty. As you know, it is a sort of mutant laboratory of cruelty politics. And similarly to what Nesrine just said, I love this idea of atmospheric cruelty. Fanon's words about this atmospheric violence. But we're also in a climate of atmospheric war. We're in an atmosphere of war. In the past, there were topics that were connected to consensus, and it has been replaced by mechanisms of war. What depended on consensus before, now it depends on war. And we see this in different manners in different countries. But just like I agree with this identification of Nesrine of how cruelty in terms of political tools from Argentina, I can talk about cruelty as a critical concept. It helps us to critique this moment and not just to describe mechanisms of power, how to do both at the same time. Why? Because in the case of Argentina, the word, the notion, the concept of cruelty has become popular. It is not just a concept that is used in universities, academia, political analysis. It's a concept that is present in the daily vocabulary of the people to define what is happening. And I think this term that was made available to characterize what is happening, thanks to the fact that it's a concept that has been debated and pushed by a cycle of trans, feminist, and anti-racist protests in our country and in several countries, who have worked a lot to try and define what are the current forms of violence and to create a popular conception about how the different forms of violence are connected and how to produce an assessment of violence in systemic terms and at the same time completely connected to the ways in which we experience this violence in the bodies and the specific territories. I think this capacity to offer this dialogue, situated and systemic at the same time, is connected to the work that has been done by the anti-racist and the feminist struggles to modify the narratives. So the fact that today the notion of cruelty is present as a term, a colloquial term, I think it is connected to a politicization of the term, a politicization of the debate on violence. This is one first item that I think is important, one first topic. The second one is connected to how we can understand, at least in countries where we come from, protests and demonstrations, how can we understand the political use of cruelty as a response or a backlash to other forms of political organization that have precisely organized interdependence dynamics, dynamics of organization of social life, provision of services, reorganization of healthcare, education, questioning hierarchy, which are connected precisely to questioning hierarchies, inflexibilities of these patriarchal, racist, sexist, colonial dynamics. And they have then experience with other practices, with other modes of existence. And I think to the attempt of canceling, blocking, and even annihilating these experiments of other modes of being, that's what this moment of cruelty is connected to. And I think there is a political sequence to analyze there. Cruelty does not come by chance. It does not just happen at any time. Cruelty is a response. It is an attempt to signal the end, the failure, the defeat of certain political experiments. And as Nasrin said, I completely agree that cruelty is nothing new. We can find in history different moments, and what we see again and again is the association of cruelty with moments of conquest and genocide. And this historical association is what becomes a public and generalized situation. Cruelty is connected to certain types of states, specifically colonial states, which always rule by producing areas where cruelty is allowed and legitimate. What we see today is some sort of expansion of cruelty as the only mode of governing, an expansion of cruelty as a response to other attempts to solve the crisis of neoliberalism, extractivism, and the attack on social, community, and interpersonal bonds. So this dimension of historic filiation is absolutely connected to the way in which cruelty produces. And now I'm going to quote a friend, an Argentinian anthropologist who has also circulated a very important concept. Rita Segato, she talks about the pedagogies of cruelty, how cruelty and the exercise of cruelty produce pedagogical forms, produces scenes in which they want to show a certain form of social bonds. In the case of Argentina, with the far-right government, for example, showing on TV the permanent repression on retired persons, persons with disabilities, social movements, is the logical consequence of the images of the genocide, and they strengthen one another. And they also organize a rationality which is both global, national, local, and territorial. So I think this expansion of cruelty as a logic that allows us to read the global and the local dimension is what has changed. So we no longer have only specific areas of cruelty. Cruelty is global, is everywhere, and is at the same time territorial, located and expanded at the same time. The logic of cruelty is the exercise of violence and making a show out of violence. Here we can see the pedagogical dimension. We can see the expansive and communicative dimension of cruelty. Making a show out of cruelty leads us to the political economy of cruelty. What sort of capital gain does cruelty get when it is shown and used as currency? Cruelty as a gold standard that allows us to understand situations that happen locally and globally. We understand what happens in the Rio de Janeiro massacre because of the way the bodies are positioned, because we've seen that already in the images of the genocide in Gaza. We've seen the same images. So this making a show out of violence generates visual images that work as a general equivalent, as a standard that allows us to understand, to read the way in which capitalism works at the different scales where it acts. So this historic affiliation with the moments of genocide, this capacity to make a show out of violence and cruelty becomes an equivalent, a standard. And this is used by the far right, in the case of Argentina, but not just there. And we cannot think of Milei without thinking of Trump, for example. So the idea of leaders who say, I can do anything. I can do anything because I can, simply because I can. This is the permanent narrative that legitimates this exercise of cruelty. And in the case of the government in Argentina, the questions of how they have trespassed red lines, their answer is always, I did it because I can. There is this delusion of fascism, of appropriation, and it is confirmed by this power of doing. I can do it, and this power of doing is deployed with cruelty, not just the exercise of violence, but making a show out of the use of violence as a fascist power. That's their power. These leaders, time and again, are saying, I can. There are no boundaries, there are no limits. I can do whatever I want. And this idea that I can generates fascination as well, fascination in what they can do. They seem to be able to cross any borders. There are no boundaries to them. And other political powers speak about this idea that there are no limits. Their power, their unlimited power, I think connects very well with this logic of cruelty. And one final point that is connected to how this is articulated, and Nesrin said this very well, the economies of hatred, how this cruelty is deep-rooted in economies of hate. Nesrin said they exploit scarcity, but we could also said that they lay the foundations for financialization, the conversion of our daily needs, our survival needs, into a new ground for the accumulation of financial capital. So there is an exploitation of scarcity, as Nesrin said, but I think there's also the production of a breeding ground in which they're going to exploit this scarcity through dynamics and financial devices that time and again are activating hatred for others, for what I cannot have, but they also activate our capacity to do. They speak to us not only as victims, but as doers. And I think in that there is a very complex element of how finances debts in daily economy, once these daily economies have become deprived, impoverished, they also promise an idea of I can, I have the power. And this idea of I can on my own, in the midst of this poverty, cannot be acted upon without an economy of hate, which also finds a very personal daily effect close to the ground, which allows us to understand also why these projects of cruelty are articulated as effective economies, political economies, economies that are global, but that at the same time are very situated and of a scale that can be recognized in each place. And what are they responding to? Or they are responding as ways of discrediting, devaluing, or even annihilating other attempts, other social bonds, other ways of relating to one another and other economies. And I think if we look back, if we look at protests in the past, well, I think they led to these essays, to these attempts to break away with the idea of a genocidal capitalism. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Veronica.
Bueno, y Edurne Portela.
And Edurne Portela, writer and essayist, and in all of her work she writes about violence, memory and unrootedness. In 2016 she published El eco de los disparos, cultura y memoria de la violencia, where she researched the representation of violence in culture in relation to the conflict of the Basque Country. As a novelist, in 2017 she wrote Mejor la ausencia. She received the Madrid Booksellers Guild Prize in 2018, and she won the Euskadi Prize of Literature with Closed Eyes, Ojos Cerrados. Recently, together with José Ovejero, she published Una belleza terrible, and they also work together in a documentary, Life in Fiction, Vida y Ficción. She works with different media outlets, written and audiovisual. And Edurne, I will ask you the same question. What do you want to tell us about cruelty tonight?
Ahora, sí.
I would like to, just like my colleagues and Joseba, thank the CCCV for inviting me, and then the Global Studies of Georgetown University. For me, it is a pleasure to share this space, this time. I think it's very stimulating to start talking about cruelty. You've done so from this politics of cruelty, from this perspective, because of your training and your interest, and I'm also interested in analyzing and seeing cruelty and what we can do with it from the point of view of cultural production and the creation of alternative imaginaries. As you said, it's not the first time in history in which the practice and the exhibition of cruelty is seen as something positive, as something to emulate. You've talked about several forms of cruelty that are organized, orchestrated by the state, but there are many others that may not be so visible, but still their impacts are devastating. These invisible cruelties of the markets that you also alluded to, the dispossession of the Global South, which is not only geographically localized in the South, but is also inscribed and is found in the bodies when we see how many of these persons from the South come to our borders. And when we deny them, or when we cannot acknowledge their existence in our spaces, we exercise a form of cruelty upon them. We try to either invisibilize them or to remove them from our social body. Veronica, you also mentioned the lack of consensus. The consensus have disappeared. We thought we all agreed, for example, in areas such as the social rejection of sexist violence. Now they call us feminazis, or they call us the defenders of the politically correct. And another invisible violence, which may sound strange to you, but I'm thinking a lot these days about this. I consider it to be a form of cruelty, a targeted form of cruelty, which is that AI is imposed on us as something unescapable. I see it as a giant funnel that suctions creativity, and it produces homogenized forms of knowledge, and it dooms us to directed knowledge. Directed by whom? Because this is a cruel power they are exercising upon us. So this leads to paralysis, and I check my survival kit that contains not protein bars or ropes, but cultural artifacts, and in my case it's literature. And I check it, and I see, I believe, I hope I'm not too naive, but I think we can not only resist, but also combat. We can fight. We can not just point at, but also create and denaturalize these forms of cruelty that are already normalized. And here I would like to say something, because I think that even in the discourse of the left wing, not just the political discourse of the parties or progressive governments, but also in the narrative on the streets, the daily narratives of the left wing, we're also assuming forms of cruelty, especially in social media. And later we can talk more about this if you feel like it. But what I would like to propose is a form of dissent, which is the dissent of imagination. We're talking a lot about imagination these days. This morning we talked about it as well, but not just any type of imagination. I'm talking about an ethical imagination. I think we may all agree to the fact that imagination is a form of knowledge that broadens wisdom, sometimes for the worse, but it is necessary to project ourselves into the future and to create what hasn't been formed yet, so that the ideas we imagine become embodied. And this idea of moral imagination, we called it this morning, or ethical imagination, is connected to a transformative imagination, which in a way points at and reveals these mechanisms and narratives of hegemonic cruelty, but on the other side, it does something. It contributes something creative. It brings us other ways of interpreting reality. So it's a disruptive imagination also because it helps us decontaminate ourselves. I think our imagination is contaminated by this atmosphere of cruelty. And our language is contaminated, our visions are contaminated, our imaginary, our collective imagination, that we project ourselves because of these narratives of cruelty that are very much connected to something that has been discussed a lot these couple of days, which is fierce individualism, and this idea that Marina Garcés mentioned yesterday, this motto during the cold drop last year, saying only the people will save the people. It's a depolitized way of thinking of the commons. And I think we are being contaminated, and not by chance, by these individualistic narratives that are very much connected to the exercise of cruelty. So where do I find my foundations, my nutrients, the nutrients that I need to feed this imagination that I consider to be ethical or transformative? You also talked about the narratives of the past and how cruelty is not something only of the present time. So I'm finding this in testimonial literature. I'm very much involved in it lately, which is the one that witnesses collective traumatic events through an individual voice that is never just a self, it's always an us. And through this type of literature that resorts to traumatic experiences, but from the collective point of view, well, I'm mostly interested in those that do not domesticate horror. This is an idea of Salfred Lander, narratives that do not force a meaning upon cruelty or horror to comfort ourselves, but to analyze it. And they express this horror and this cruelty in such a way that we are horrified, we are overwhelmed, and they speak to us, as Marina said yesterday, of what's unimaginable. The unimaginable has happened, will continue to happen. It has been experienced, it has been told, it will be experienced, it will be told. So I think we shouldn't dismiss the power of this type of imagination, the power of being overwhelmed, daunted, to face these narratives and also to face and challenge the practice of cruelty. And then, well, if you're interested, I can also tell you about what part of this repertoire that we have of testimonial or the stories of witnesses can help us to go back to certain aspects of these traumatic experiences that are not only connected to pain, but also to resistance and to ways of thinking resistance together. Thank you very much, Edurne. My name is Joseba Elola. I run the Ideas supplement of the El País journal for debate topics. You can access it on the website, and on Sundays you can find them on news outlets. Thank you, Tom and Pankaj, for inviting me to be a part of these Georgetown Global Dialogues, and of course, thank you, Judith Carrera. The first thing I wanted to go to is the foundations of cruelty, because there are so many topics, so much cruelty in the world we live in, so it's very difficult to choose where to start. I wanted to start at the foundations. The Spanish Royal Academy Dictionary says that cruelty is impiety, fierceness of the soul. But this author, who was born in Riga, wrote about cruelty in Ordinary Vices and the liberalism of fear, and she said that cruelty is a physical or emotional damage that a person or a group with power inflicts voluntarily on someone weaker with the aim of reaching a goal. This is her definition. So the weakness of the person who receives the violence is one of the keys of cruelty. I don't know if any of you would like to talk about that. Well, to start, I would like to question that idea of inhumanity. Cruelty is human. Svetan Todorov said in an interview, I think, they asked him about evil, how to fight evil. If we want to eradicate evil, we would need to be a different species. Evil resides within all of us, and I think cruelty does as well. Nasrin said before that there is a way of activating that cruelty with certain policies. Or I don't know, maybe you said it, Veronica, but you probably agree as well. Cruelty is inherently human. And I think what differentiates cruelty and violence is the cruel gesture. And Nasrin, you also said before that, and I think Veronica mentioned it as well, you talked about the component of humiliation. For cruelty to be effective, it needs this component of humiliation. And if there's an audience, even better. This we've seen historically. For example, in the case of the Jews, they were forced to parade in Germany and other places with signs, and even with the yellow cross. It was a way of, or the yellow star. It was a performative form of violence. So that would be one first thought that I wanted to offer. Do you want to add anything, Nasrin, Veronica?
Hello. So much to talk about. I want to just talk a little bit about how cruelty, just to go back to our kind of themes of solidarity and understanding each other. I think cruelty is activated, but also cruelty has many purposes, right? And it's practiced for many different reasons. Sometimes the more you want to humiliate people and you want to parade them, and we see this, especially amongst prisoners of war, amongst people that are at the very sharp end of military occupation or military rule. There's something so interesting about and I believe Hisham spoke about something similar yesterday. There's something so revealing about why, as a soldier or a torturer or a policeman, having full dominion over a prisoner or a detainee and still wanting to humiliate him further or her further, still wanting to break him further. And I think there's so much going on there that can't just be reduced to cruelty is just part of who we are. I think cruelty also is fear, and it is insecurity. And sometimes the more you want to humiliate or diminish someone else, the more you want to purge something from you, right? Or the more you want to build yourself up or make yourself feel strong. I believe so much of, or some of cruelty is also an expression of weakness, right? Or an expression of wanting to illustrate your power in the most vulgar, graphic way possible, so that reassures you that you cannot be the person on the other end. And so I think there are ways in which we can really extend a lot of sympathy to cruel people. And I'll give a very small example of this. I'm from Sudan, which is in the throes of an extremely brutal war at the moment, uncharacteristically brutal. It's been 2.5 years, and there hasn't been a single humanitarian pause or ceasefire for 2.5 years. That's very unusual. I mean, even in Gaza, there was a ceasefire, ish. But anyway, no, there isn't even a push for a ceasefire. And so the crimes, the atrocities being committed by one side in that war are very performative. They film the videos, they post them online, they talk to the people before they kill them, they humiliate them, they tell them, they show them that death is coming. So a huge part of it is this projection of their power. And the other side, which is the kind of more privileged, more cosmopolitan side, or metropolitan side, should I say, of the army in the center, which is fighting these rebels, have been talking about these rebels as basically, and I quote, monsters in human form, or devils in human form. And they do not reckon with the fact that these rebels are coming from a historical context where they have been marginalized, economically disenfranchised, abused, treated with racism and contempt for decades and decades. That's just not part of the picture. It's like these people, like weeds, sprung up overnight, cruel. And I just don't, and most of them are teenagers, most of them are children. And you think, if you can look at an 18-year-old committing a crime, an atrocity, and filming it and enjoying it, that is a person that deserves a huge amount of sympathy and empathy, because something has been warped in them that they need to do this to fortify themselves. So I think what is missing sometimes from our discourse on cruelty and where it comes from and its origins and its definitions is that it's not an act that is executed because it exists in human beings and sometimes is activated. It is also linked to all the other ways in which we need to survive, right? And claw back some sense of pride, dignity, status, etc. There's something very human about cruelty. It's I think, like all impulses that exist in human nature, they are there to, like you said, would be a different species. They are there to further our survival, right? Somehow. And so I think the trick is, if we're going to start talking about solutions, or what can we do with this inevitability of cruelty in human nature, is think about the circumstances, right? What is the context? How is it activated? How do you activate competing impulses to cruelty? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tal vez creo que se podría pensar cuál es la función política.
I think we could think of the political function of cruelty, meaning that at many points, politics are proposed as a mediation or limitation apparatus, as a capacity to define the areas where cruelty can be exercised. And I think the question we're asking now is, what happens with politics that rather say explicitly that there is no limits to violence, to cruelty. The functionality of politics has changed to the extent of, at some point, cruelty was something that had to be mediated or contained in a way and limit to certain geographical areas, because cruelty is a permanent, a constant in capitalism. But what happens in capitalism as political machinery that makes cruelty no longer be limited or constrained. And on the other side, this violence becomes a show that connects us to moments of genocide in the past, and which at the same time proposes an economy of hate, which is precisely the one that wants to show that there is a benefit in exercising cruelty. There's a profit to be gained from cruelty. So this violence has this capacity to offer. Cruelty is an effect in daily transactions, a way of sustaining the bonds. I think there's a political question there. What is the role of violence, of cruelty? What has changed in the political use of cruelty, inasmuch as institutions no longer seem to need to limit it or mediate it, but are rather gaining profit from its expansion and from this lack of boundaries, of limits? That's the way in which daily bonds are deployed, as if there's an anthropological truth in violence. So what does capitalism, or how does capitalism use violence for political purposes at the moment? Now that we're talking about this political violence, I wanted to mention, although Nesrine already mentioned it in passing in her presentation, but I wanted to talk about Donald Trump and the bullies, the lack of empathy. That's what, these are the features of bullies. And making a show finds echoes in other areas of our society. This abusing the dominating position, this intimidating the weak. This is seen at schools or at offices, and we see it now in the Oval Office of the White House. So maybe you could analyze, where does this exhibition of bullying lead us to in our society, amongst our citizens?
Claro, es que es lo que decía un poquito antes, ¿no?
Well, as I said before,
Toda la sociedad está permeada
all of society is permeated by these types of attitudes,
y estamos contaminados.
and we are contaminated by these type of cruel attitudes.
Hay en el trato cotidiano,
In
sobre todo en el espacio
the
digital,
in our daily interactions, especially in the digital sphere, this bullying is ever present, and these new hypermasculinities as well that are very violent.
claro, aquí podemos decir en nuestro contexto,
In our context,
claro, no tiene nada que ver todavía con lo que está sucediendo en Argentina.
which is completely, it's very far away from what is happening in Argentina, but we're seeing
Que no estamos preparados
the monster rearing its teeth, and I think we're not ready, we're not prepared to fight it, at least not yet.
que a mí sí me preocupa.
And there's something that concerns me, which is that we focus a lot, and I think it's necessary, but we focus a lot in trying to understand
Cómo nos afecta.
why this bullying, how does this bullying impact us? Why, for example, in Spain, young people lean more towards a far right? Why they're buying this cruel narrative, why they are buying into it, and we do not pay enough attention to that part of youth that you mentioned, Veronica,
Del uso o del análisis de la crueldad
You talked about the analysis of cruelty also as a politic form of resistance,
A mí me gustaría también reflexionar
a form of
sobre
political
esa
resistance. So I would like to also reflect upon
está
this
resistiendo
part of the youth who are resisting
esa avalancha de
this avalanche
imaginarios
of
que muchos de sus compañeros los compran.
imaginaries
Esta
that
mañana,
many of
uno
their
de los
peers are buying
estudiantes
into. This morning, one of the
ha
students
preguntado, ¿no?
asked,
¿Cómo comparto la esperanza que
how
puedo
can I
tener yo
share
en
my
acción política?
hope in political action with my colleagues who are
Desconectados
absolutely disconnected from any sort of struggle?
A mí me gustaría que igual también fuéramos un poco por ahí.
So I would like to maybe talk about that as well.
Estamos asfixiados
We are
por toda esta violencia ambiental.
suffocated by all of this violence in the atmosphere. But what happens with those who resist?
Igual tú, Joseba, desde
And maybe, Joseba, you from the point of view of journalism can say something as well.
tan
Why this
fijo, ¿no? en
interest, intense
jóvenes
interest
abrazando la ultraderecha y la falta de discursos
for the far right by the youth? Why are they embracing these narratives? We're seeing others that are supporting Gaza, for example, strongly. Well, the rise of far right amongst the youth is very complex, and we would need to devote an entire session to that, but I would rather we focus on cruelty and to go deeper into this matter. I would like to go back to what Nesrine said in her comments as well about technology, the role of technology that you alluded to, Edurne, as well. And cruelty is sequestering our attention and is monetized. It's like a product. And I wanted to know, do you think that this cruelty that is traveling through social media and that we're witnessing, is it managing to alter our humanity, our empathy, our solidarity? Are we on a path to dehumanization, or do you think solidarity, kindness, empathy will be able to make it through as much as we're intoxicated by this violence?
I picked up the mic the moment you said social media. Because I think social media is very interesting. Because it is a double-edged sword. And I think it has become sometimes a useful fall guy, a useful thing to put the acceleration of cruelty on. Social media is, there's two things I want to say. Number one is that social media's acceleration of cruelty is not about humans becoming more cruel, but it is because social media is about making money. That's all it's there for. That's why people create it. That's why people grow companies and sell them on and get paid billions of dollars for it. And the currency of social media is engagement. It's clicking, sharing, commenting, forwarding. Social media is useless if it's only consumed and not interacted with, because then it just becomes media. And so if you look at the research and listen to sort of testimonies from people who work in the engineering of social media, a very basic premise is that you need to figure out what will get people to engage. Cruelty, anger. Anger is the first thing. Anger is the thing that gets people to engage most. The second thing that gets people to engage is a sort of show, right? A fight. Somebody being humiliated, somebody being punched, somebody being, taken apart in an argument. So it kind of mimics an almost medieval public square or kind of public execution element, right? Which is people to come and rubberneck and see and get a kind of second-hand thrill from what's happening. I think I don't think we talk about this enough, that what we see on social media is essentially a commodification of human feelings, whether they're cruelty, anger, etc. And that they are about creating content and making sure that content is shared. And within that environment, therefore, you get, because human beings are economic beings, you will get cruelty entrepreneurs, right? People who see there's a gold rush with this commodity, and they will come and they will create accounts, including sometimes bot accounts, so not even human accounts, and all they do is spit out provocative statements or cruel statements or anti-immigration statements or racist statements to get people to pile in. There's a whole industry now of kind of cruelty mongers or hate mongers on social media. So there's a whole kind of economic commodity element to social media that is not on the heads of the people who are on it. It's kind of on the different algorithms. And in a way, I think we need to think about it as the algorithm rather than social media, because the algorithm lurks everywhere, actually, not just in social media platforms. The second thing I'd like to say about that is that the second threat of social media when it comes to cruelty, I think is the biggest problem, is that sense of, as Dean Masri put it, I wrote it down here, which was so beautifully put, isolation masquerading as autonomy. This sense that even because we see people all the time and we talk to them all the time and we interact with them all the time, we feel like we are living and running our lives autonomously and independently, otherwise known, I believe, as main character syndrome, where you feel like you're the main character in your life, you're the main protagonist, and you're dealing with the rest of the world. But actually, you're not talking to anyone, you're not seeing anyone, you're not looking into the whites of anyone's eyes. That creates a lower hurdle for cruelty, because you don't get to see the hurt, the fear, that it becomes a game. And social media's acceleration of cruelty and exists in this really good synergy with political cruelty, and that's why actually politicians are so are fans of social media. Right-wing politicians are fans of social media because, again, it's this feedback loop. But I do think that social media itself, or the practice of social media itself, is a kind of spell that has been cast. And I think it can be broken. And already you are seeing people recoil from different parts of social media. The cruelest parts of social media, particularly. Twitter is, I think, almost dead in terms of the kind of mass usage it had in the past. And you're seeing young people in particular self-select out towards milder, more joyful types of social media. And I'll just say one brief thing. I think that is connected to something that was said earlier about, like, where do we go? Are we in trouble? Is cruelty our fate and our doom? And I think there's something cannibalizing about cruelty once it reaches a certain critical mass. There's a very good book called Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl, where he talks about how the way the right in the US has managed to extend its fortune is by convincing white people to vote against their own interests because they don't want Black people to get what they have. So they will vote against free healthcare because they don't want Black people to get free healthcare. They will vote against gun regulation because they don't want to give up their own guns, right? Because they want to be, but then they will die predominantly more than Black people because of gun violence. So people end up in a position where they are constantly voting against their own self-interest and making decisions motivated by cruelty while cannibalizing their own system, their own social system. So I'm a little bit more hopeful. I think that there is an inherent vulnerability, kind of like a Ponzi scheme element to cruelty, where after a point there's just not enough people to blame. There's not enough people to blame, and you can kind of see it already now that they can't pass the parcel anymore. And so people are coming up. We've got in the UK the Greens, a new left-wing party. You've got Zohran Mamdani. The spell breaks when there's no longer anyone else to pass the cruelty on to. I'll stop there.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos un pequeño problema.
Thank you very much. We have a bit of an issue. Time flies in an unbelievable manner. We've eaten up a lot of the time that we had for questions. I have like 300 questions that I would like to ask you, but let's pass the floor over to the audience. Let's see who wants to ask questions.
Wonderful panel, fascinating inputs. Thank you, everybody. I was wondering if you would like to include the concept of shame, or rather shamelessness, into this cruelty. Because Veronica, especially you talked about how cruelty is inherent in capitalism. But where does it come from, actually? Like, I think the source, well, I think that the source is shame, and how we got used to shamelessness, and how now, especially with Trump and Milei, it became a spectacle, radical refusal of shame, or radical shamelessness. And they are almost trying to institutionalize this, because as we all know, and Americans will soon learn, that it will trickle down to the capillary system of the society, and daily life will be full of minions of Trump, like it is full of minions of Milei. How do you see the connection between shame, shamelessness, capitalism, neoliberal morality, and cruelty? I'm actually asking all of you, but yeah, since you're coming from Argentina, I think you have this fresh feelings for about the topic.
Bueno, creo que es una pregunta que va al...
I think it's a question that goes to the core of the matter. At least in Argentina, when we listen to Milei, the idea of shame is a feeling of the weak, a feeling assigned to the weak. And it is related to this feature of a power associated to cruelty. I can do anything. There are no limits to what I can do. And of course, without these feelings associated to a weak and decadent morality, which would be traditional politics, which says it has these feelings, but it actually doesn't. So I think these politicians, in the case of Milei, it's very clear. At the same time, well, they benefit from a crisis of the political representation system. In the case of Argentina, Milei says he's the ultimate effect of the crisis of 2001, which was a crisis of political representation when social movements and protests said away with them all, as a generalized disenchantment with politics, but with a call to action to do away with the institutions and therefore to self-manage collective life in different manners. I think Milei is saying there's been an absolute destitution, but also a criminalization of the ways in which social reproduction and collective life was. There was an attempt at managing them in a different manner. So what he proposes, what he offers, is a social bond based on cruelty. I like what Nesrine said about cruelty as an entrepreneurial dynamic. Milei did a political campaign through saying, well, he had a video, a bizarre, handcrafted video, in which he talked about how he was going to destroy the different state bureaus that gave rights to certain collectives. This video went viral. He was like stripping instances of rights, and he promised to do away with those rights, these social rights. And this video represented a generalized enjoyment of democratizing the stripping of rights. And it was not going to be the concern of a specific collective. It was going to be a democratization of the experience of cruelty. And I think there's a very perverse twist what they're promising is a democratization of suffering, in a way. So, of course, they make a very specific use of the idea of privilege. The idea that these ideas that come from the protests of the past, the protests against privilege, these are the notions being mobilized by the far right. And the effective dynamic they're promoting is a democratization of this lack of rights, a democratization of this feeling of not being represented, and a democratization of enjoyment of cruelty. So I think we always think, when it comes to the far right, we always think of where they are failing, but we need to think in terms of what they're offering that makes sense to certain people in societies that have been systematically under attack. There's a hand raised there. My question is about something that wasn't said about cruelty in progressive movements. You mentioned it in passing, Edurne. So how do we do it to, from the left, respond to these narratives of cruelty when the temptation is oftentimes to respond along the same lines, in the same terms, with this imaginary of cruelty? And how do we come out of this imaginary of cruelty to offer a strong response, but not in the same terms, not at the same level of that cruelty? I don't know if I have an answer to that. It's very difficult when we come into these dynamics that reproduce, I wouldn't say the same level of cruelty, but for example, when we talk about feminism, feminism has suffered a lot in the past few years because of a radical division in terms of trans-exclusive feminism or not. For example, in the context of Spanish feminism. And the debates that have been had in feminism in this context have been brutal. They've been of an extreme cruelty.
And that's when I started thinking, listen, we are developing strange forms of engaging, we're breaking with a way of developing bonds that has taken centuries. And sometimes we name and blame the right wing of manipulating the discourse, but I think we're now all contaminated. And we all do politics in a similar way, in the way we think about the adversary, the opponent rather. And let me go back to referring to values which have been undermined on the grounds of this narrative according to which there is a certain way of acting towards others that undermines us, right? That makes us more vulnerable, when in fact I think we should embrace vulnerability, or at least we should have a shared narrative within left-wing movements. And I again insist in the importance of accepting, embracing vulnerability, and thinking that perhaps there is a common grounds that we can, build everything from scratch on this common ground. This morning, Hisham Matar shared a beautiful story about his father. He explained how he spent many years in jail. He was tortured and humiliated, but he recognized that there was something in him that had not been affected by the perpetrators or by jail. And I would like to think that those of us who believe in a world, in the possibility of a different world, in the possibility of a better world, those who believe that even 19 years old murderers who can kill, well, those who still believe that there is, a certain beauty in others. We need to try and preserve this shelter, this refuge, this lighthouse from where to build or rebuild a political relationship that leaves the cruelty narrative behind. And as I said earlier, for me, testimonial literature is an incredible source of inspiration, because in this transmission of trauma, one finds a transmission of values. Values hold very dear by people who thought that by sacrificing their lives, and I'm speaking here about politically active people, right? People who thought that by, being martyrs, they could transform the world. The transformative potential, I believe we all have inside, and for me, hope is there. So let's listen to one last question. Maybe there's time for one last question. If you don't have more questions, I have 300. So, oh yeah, there's one here. Great. Apologies. No, do not apologize. Can you hear me? Yes, loud and clear. First of all, thank you very much to the four of you. I found it most interesting. Like Edurne Portela, I also find a lot of beauty in testimonial literature. And I would like to go back to two main figures of resistance, Semprún and Neus Català, who spent years in concentration camps. From Semprún, I remember he was saved by poetry. This morning we've discussed about evocation and the importance of humanities, like in the case of Semprún, right? Reading poetry saved him. Thinking about Neus Català, what about her? I would like to remember her capacity, not in Ravensbrück, but in another concentration camp. Her and her peers would sabotage the bombs that were being developed to kill the allies, to bombard the allies. And here comes my question, which is a little bit prosaic and quite specific. Are there any forms of sabotaging cruelty? I think, Veronica, that Argentina is also a lab of sabotage. A sabotage lab. If you could give us like a tip, Veronica, and the rest of you, of course.
Sorry.
Okay, so how can you do the sabotage of cruelty?
Oh, yes. I'll be brief. So I just think it's important, now that we've talked very heavily about cruelty for an hour, is to just point out that considering this assault from governments, from billionaires, from social media, it is a miracle that so much good still exists in the world. Not only good, but also bravery and risk-taking and resistance. It has been, even though it's been a particularly bleak couple of years, and bleak few years in general, I find that hugely encouraging. And that these are not our fates, actually. Cruelty is not our fate, even when you deploy huge amounts of resources behind it. It somehow doesn't take as much as you expect it to. And also that there is an understanding, I think, on behalf of these cruel regimes and entrepreneurs, that they are extremely vulnerable to the understanding of those on the other side, that all you need to do is get together. It's a very simple thing. So, for example, Egypt, which is an incredibly tightly controlled, sealed-off fascist state in which there is no risk of revolution, has thousands and thousands of political prisoners. Because all it takes is 4 or 5, right, to create a community. In the UK, they are banning pro-Palestine movements. even though there is no risk to the UK government from pro-Palestine movements. And so this, I think, betrays an understanding that the sabotaging of cruelty is in fact very easy, right? And very available, because it's just about 2 or more people getting in a room and talking like we are, and then asking a few more people to do the same. And so I think the sabotaging of cruelty happens, first of all, through these kinds of conversations. Second of all, through public spaces, through meeting other people in public and discoursing with them in public. And number 3, through understanding that there is no reason to despair because they don't own this, right? They're not here. And so I'm actually quite hopeful because I think there is again, to go back to this concept of breaking the spell, it's just about breaking the spell and understanding that it is about community making, going out into the physical world and just saying and understanding that it doesn't have to be this way. And like I said, we're seeing that already in many parts of the world.
¿Puedo agregar algo?
Sí, rapidísimo.
Can I add something? Yeah, really brief, please. Now, regarding to what Edurne was mentioning about embracing vulnerability and the question around Argentina, the social groups that has been protesting in the streets more recently are retirees and people living with handicap, as well as organizations, care-oriented organizations. So, of course, if there are groups out there who embrace vulnerability as political tool, these are the main characters, right? And they invite more and more people to join them. They invite more and more actors to better understand what it means to be affected by the government policies and why that's just unacceptable when it affects specific lives, right? Out of the situation of vulnerability and out of sharing what it means to be out in the street, when in fact the proposal is privatizing ill-being, no matter how, but privatizing ill-being is the political mandate. This is what the financial institutions aim at, right? You don't have resources or networks, you can hire them. You can hire them, pay for them. The interest rate will be extremely high. All your feelings can be privatized. So these mobilization experiences, these social groups who embrace their vulnerability and at the same time they've proved to have an important political power, they are again urging us to avoid privatizing ill-being and breaking these dynamics of cruelty as a normal thing. And this is one of the dynamics as these governments are trying to widespread in Argentina in the context of the financial crisis, right? The currency crisis is at the center of the political debate. Amazing. Listening to you has been an absolute privilege. If there's something clear out there is that women will save us of cruelty, that's for sure. Thank you very much for joining us, and I think they deserve a clap. Thank you.